day began with rain, as most strange days in St. Mary Mead often did, though this particular one promised more than a ruined garden party. Mrs. Lavinia Beecham, the village's famed cookbook author, had been expected to host a modest luncheon, featuring recipes from her new volume Cakes and Crimes, a culinary memoir. Instead, her maid found her sprawled lifeless across the polished kitchen floor at 11:10, a copper saucepan still simmering on the aga, and an untouched lemon tart cooling near the window. The local constable, Sergeant Wiles, arrived before the doctor and did his best not to touch anything. But there was little doubt. Mrs. Beecham was dead, face twisted unnaturally, her mouth flecked with something white and granular, not a mark, on her body. No smell of gas, no broken windows, no sign of struggle. Her purse still sat on the kitchen chair, her jewelry box undisturbed. Only one thing seemed out of place, a handwritten recipe card lying beside her hand, though its ink had run with a smear, making the title unreadable. By noon, the talk had travelled down every lane and into every teacup. Suicide was floated. Then, dismissed. Lavinia had been far too vain for that, not to mention 2 chapters into a sequel and recently quoted in the Times. Poison, then? But the remains of her breakfast, toast and marmalade, showed nothing alarming. Her cook, a young girl, named Elsie, claimed she hadn't served the lady anything unusual. The last visitor to the house had been a delivery boy, bringing in cream and eggs. Mrs. Beecham had sent him away with 2 slices of walnut cake, as was her custom. By all accounts, she had been in good spirits. The only oddity anyone could agree on was the smell. Not of almonds or gas or anything ominous, but something oddly sweet, as though caramel had been left too long on the stove. A scent that lingered faintly even after the doors were opened and the windows thrown wide. The doctor's early verdict was inconclusive. No trauma, possibly poisoning, but no immediate signs. The kitchen was locked from the inside, the windows shut. If someone had murdered Lavinia Beecham, they had done it without leaving so much as a scuffed shoe print behind. The only item that drew any attention was the curious recipe card. Though partly ruined, the remaining lines listed ingredients that made no sense together. Lavender buds, crushed aspirin, gooseberry syrup, cod liver oil. A joke, a draft, or a code. There were no other recipe cards like it in her kitchen, only the neatly typed pages of her current manuscript, which all seemed perfectly normal. The book spine lay open on her counter to a page titled Summer Pudding for the Weak-Hearted. Miss Marple, who had once offered some very helpful suggestions during the mysterious affair of the vicar's lost umbrella and the vanished threepenny, coin, had been reading in her parlour when word reached her via Mrs. Bantry's excited knock. "She's dead, Jane, Lavinia Beecham, and not a single soul knows why." Miss Marple blinked, set aside her embroidery, and pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. "Oh dear," she murmured, "how very inconvenient." Was there cake involved? By the time Miss Marple arrived at the Beecham house, the doctor had departed, and the body had been respectfully covered. Elsie was weeping softly in the pantry, and Sergeant Wiles looked pale, as if he'd been forced to consider murder for the first time in years. Miss Marple, with her soft eyes and slightly distracted air, examined the scene slowly. She noticed the tart still cooling, the saucepan still warm, the peculiar note, and the absence of the daily tea tray. She didn't take her usual tea. "At 11?" she asked gently. The maid shook her head, said she wasn't thirsty. She just wanted to finish her sauce. The sauce, thick, dark, aromatic, still steamed faintly. Miss Marple dipped the edge of a spoon into the pot and sniffed. "Interesting," she said. "Do you recall what she put in this?" Elsie shrugged. "Just the usual, shallots, port wine, stock. She was testing something new, I think, but I didn't see anything odd go in." "Any callers this week?" Miss Marple continued. Anyone unexpected? Perhaps someone who dropped off a gift? The maid paused. Oh, only a small parcel yesterday. No return address, just a box of wrapped sweets. Said it was from an admirer. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her tone remained light. And she tried them? Elsie nodded. Just one. Said it was too sweet. Later that evening, while everyone else puzzled over the recipe card and the locked room, Miss Marple sat quietly at her writing desk, flipping through an old book on herbal remedies. She had seen the odd combination of ingredients somewhere. Before, not in any cookbook, but in a rather unpleasant case involving a governess and a very spoiled little boy in Sussex. A peculiar blend of calming herbs and irritants, lethal only in particular combinations. Most would taste strange, but do little harm. But when paired with certain medications, say digitalis or a mild diuretic, they could prove fatal, especially to someone with a known heart condition. Miss Marple remembered, because she had clipped the article and kept it under interesting ailments. The next morning she returned to the Beecham house with a question. Did Lavinia have visitors? From abroad recently? Elsie, still pale, nodded. A cousin from Canada, stayed for a few weeks, left just 10 days ago. Miss Marple tapped the table thoughtfully. And would she, by any chance, have access to the original manuscript of Mrs. Beecham's cookbook as the day wore on? Things began to shift. The sweets were found and tested. Traces of aconitine, a deadly poison extracted from monkshood, were detected in the wrappings, not enough to alarm most, but just enough to raise suspicion. The draft of Lavinia's next chapter had gone missing, though no one had noticed. Only one person might have known what dish she'd been preparing the morning she died, someone who'd helped with recipe testing, someone who might see benefit in her early death. The village began to murmur. A locked room, a poisoned sweet, a ruined recipe card, and a cousin who had quietly disappeared back to Vancouver. And still, it wasn't quite enough, not yet. Not until Miss Marple found the answer to the last, strangest question of all. Why had the page been titled Summer Pudding for the Weak-Hearted, when no such recipe existed in the published book? Miss Marple returned to the Beecham kitchen the next morning, politely brushing past Sergeant Wiles, who stood fussing over a small notebook, as if sheer repetition of questions might yield a confession from the silverware. It's a curious business, he muttered as she stepped around him, but there's still no proper evidence of foul play. Doctor says it could have been an aneurysm, or stress, or something she ate. Naturally, I mean. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly, letting her eyes sweep the kitchen once more. So many deaths seem natural, until one begins to look at them sideways. She moved to the spice shelf. The jars gleamed, labels in her tidy handwriting. Lavinia had prided herself on order. Everything was alphabetical, allspice, basil, caraway, except for a small jar pushed behind the tarragon. Unlabeled, Miss Marple drew it forward gently. Inside was a fine powder, pale grey, not quite familiar. She replaced the lid and turned to the constable. Might I suggest you ask the coroner to test this? It may be nothing, but I once knew a girl who sprinkled powdered valerian into her husband's wine, meant only to calm his nerves, poor thing, but she misjudged the amount. Wiles blinked at her. You think this might have been in the sauce? Miss Marple tilted her head. She was experimenting, wasn't she? Unusual combinations. Lavender and gooseberry. Things that don't belong together unless one's hiding something inside. Recipes can be terribly convenient for misdirection. He jotted a note, clearly uneasy. Miss Marple continued her quiet tour of the room, eyes falling on the stack of recipe cards, all in Lavinia's familiar script, except one. Tucked beneath the flour tin was a folded scrap, browned at the corners, bearing an older hand, looping, bolder than Lavinia's delicate script. It wasn't a recipe. It was a note. I'll be watching Saturday. Don't disappoint me. No name, no envelope. She didn't mention it just yet. Instead, she asked after Lavinia's cousin. "This Canadian gentleman? What do we know of him?" Wiles scratched his chin. "Name's Harold Beecham. Writer of some sort. Travel pieces. Came about a month. Ago stayed in the guest room. Didn't mix much. Preferred long walks, apparently. Left after a row. Elsie heard them shouting about money. Or perhaps about credit," Miss Marple murmured. "Writers are rather protective of their words, and Lavinia was planning a chapter about family dishes." Wiles gave a non-committal grunt. "You think he poisoned her over a recipe?" "Think pride is a terrible motive, Sergeant, almost as terrible as envy." Miss Marple made her way to the sitting room next, where Lavinia had kept her drafts and correspondence. The air still held the scent of roses from the vase on the table, freshly changed, oddly enough. Elsie had not struck her as the sort to fuss with flowers during morning, and yet the stems had been clipped neatly. Miss Marple bent to pick up a petal that had fallen. It was streaked faintly with blue. Not from the flower, ink. She turned to the writing desk. The inkwell was uncapped, the pen set aside hastily, and a blotting sheet bore the ghost of a sentence. "You know it was never your recipe to begin with. The beginnings of a quarrel. Perhaps a letter unsent, or torn." Elsie entered the room behind, her holding a tea tray. She looked startled to find Miss Marple there, but recovered quickly. "Would you like some, miss? I thought you might." "How kind. Did you often serve tea to Mrs. Beecham here?" Elsie hesitated. "Not often. She preferred it in the kitchen, but sometimes when she had letters to answer." "Did she write many?" "Dozens. She kept carbon copies, always." The girl gestured toward the filing cabinet near the window. Miss Marple opened it gently. Inside, neat folders labeled by date and recipient. She scanned the most recent batch. Letters to her publisher, to a fan in Bournemouth, a complaint about rising postage to the postal service, and then one addressed to a solicitor regarding a legal revision to her will, dated 3 days before her death. Miss Marple's brows lifted. She asked softly, "Elsie, did you know who was to inherit her estate?" The girl shifted uncomfortably. "No." "Well, I assumed it was her niece, Margaret. She came by often. Helped edit her books. But you don't recall the last time she visited?" "Week before last. She dropped off a book galley. Stayed an hour, I think." Miss Marple returned to the kitchen, where she sat briefly and closed her eyes. It was a habit she'd developed, not from fatigue, but to let everything settle. A cousin who wrote, a niece who edited, a suspiciously vanished draft, a poisoned sweet, a recipe that didn't belong, and now a will possibly changed. She opened her eyes to find Margaret Beecham standing in the doorway, arms folded tightly, eyes red-rimmed. "You're the old lady everyone's talking about," she said with a forced smile. "Jane Marple." "I suppose I am," Miss Marple replied, studying her. "You've had quite a shock, I imagine." Margaret looked down. "I still can't believe it. She was so strong, so stubborn, nothing ever slowed her. And yet she slowed enough to change her will." Miss Marple said it without accusation, merely as fact. Margaret blinked. "What?" "Oh, it may not have gone through. But the intention was there. Did she mention it?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. "No," she said finally, "but I wouldn't be surprised. She'd been strange lately, distracted, angry." "Angry about what?" Margaret shrugged. She didn't say. But she was reworking a chapter, something she claimed had been stolen, from an old notebook. "A notebook?" "She had dozens," Margaret said. "But this one was special. She kept it locked in the cupboard behind the spice rack." Miss Marple glanced at the shelf again. The cupboard was there, but it wasn't locked now. She rose and opened it gently. Only a small indentation remained, where a book had once pressed against the wood. Gone, just like the missing chapter. "Did anyone know of this cupboard?" Miss Marple asked. "Only family," Margaret replied. "And maybe Elsie if she'd been here long enough." Miss Marple didn't respond. She looked instead at the copper saucepan, now cleaned, returned to its hook above the stove. She stepped close. A single crust of dried sauce remained under the rim, missed by even the most thorough scrubbing. She pried it gently with a fork, wrapped it in a clean napkin, and tucked it into her bag. Later that day, she sent it by post to a trusted chemist in London. She included a note. "Please test for traces of herbal compounds, sedatives, or plant toxins, particularly valerian, belladonna, or monkshood." The game, as she had once heard a clever gentleman say, was afoot. The afternoon light had grown thin and slanted by the time Miss Marple returned to the Beecham house for a quiet word. With those still lingering in the shadows of the event, she had arranged to speak first with Elsie, the maid, away from the others, under the guise of needing help locating a missing tin of lemon biscuits, though it was never really about the biscuits. Miss Marple believed people spoke more freely when their hands were busy, and Elsie's were soon occupied polishing spoons that didn't need polishing. "You were fond of her, weren't you?" Miss Marple asked softly. Elsie hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. She could be strict, but she was fair. I never minded staying late or helping with her books. But something changed recently. The girl bit her lip. She got secretive. She started locking the cupboard with the recipe notes even when no one was around. And she didn't let me taste things anymore, not the sauces or the pastries. She'd always let me try a spoonful before." Miss Marple watched the girl's face as she spoke. "Did she ever mention being afraid?" "Not afraid," Elsie said slowly. "But she got letters. I saw one. She left it on the counter by mistake. It was torn up later, but I read some of it. Said something about exposure and what's owed. I thought it was from her publisher." "Did she burn the letter?" "No, ma'am. She tore it up and threw it away." "Did you take any of it?" Elsie gave a faint nod. "Only one bit. It had initials on it, HB. That's her cousin, isn't it?" "Indeed." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "You've been very helpful." She didn't mention to Elsie that she had found another note earlier. Instead, she turned her attention to Margaret, who was seated in the sunroom flipping through an old recipe book with a dazed expression. Miss Marple joined her without asking, placing her knitting bag on the wicker table beside the untouched teacup. "Curious," she said mildly, "that Lavinia never published anything about family recipes before." Margaret looked up. She was protective. She said they were all hers, even when they weren't. "I gave her some of them. My mother's old notes years ago. She used them without crediting anyone. We had words about it, but she said that's how the industry works. And yet she mentioned changing her will recently." Margaret's mouth tightened. "She said she would. I didn't believe her. I thought it was a threat. She used it whenever we argued. 'Keep testing me, and you'll be left with nothing but crumbs,' she'd say." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You told Sergeant Wiles she hadn't seemed herself. Might you elaborate?" "She was erratic, paranoid. She said someone was trying to copy her manuscript. She accused me of leaking it. But I hadn't even seen the latest version. She said she'd been betrayed. And the last time I visited, she locked herself in the kitchen while I waited in the hall. That wasn't like her." "Did she mention Harold?" "She said he was a thief and a fraud, but she always said things like that. I never took her seriously." Margaret paused. "Do you think Harold did it?" Miss Marple only smiled gently and said, "I think everyone has told a version of the truth. The trouble is the versions don't all match." Next she asked for Harold's letters, anything he had written before leaving. But none remained. According to Elsie, Lavinia had burned them after their quarrel. What Miss Marple wanted, though, was a voice, so she requested the telephone records. It turned out Harold had placed a call from the house 2 nights before Lavinia's death, an overseas call. Expensive. Miss Marple quietly jotted down the number and passed it to Inspector Craddock, who had arrived from the county office that morning, summoned after Miss Marple's note about the suspicious spice jar. She knew the inspector well enough to trust him with delicate matters, and he trusted her enough not to question the details when she handed over the small tin of sauce crust she had saved. Afterward, she asked if she might interview the delivery boy who had brought the cream and eggs that morning. "Just routine," she explained. "Sometimes people see things and forget they've seen them." The boy was summoned, 16, freckled and fidgety. "Did you see anyone else around the house that morning?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just Mrs. Beecham. She was in a hurry, gave me cake and closed the door fast." "Did she seem unwell?" "No, but she wasn't wearing her apron, which was odd. She always had it on when she cooked." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "No apron?" "No, ma'am." When he left, she asked Elsie who'd washed the apron last. "I did," the maid said. "Found it in the basket, but it was clean. Dry, too, as if it hadn't been used." Miss Marple turned that over in her mind. Lavinia's last sauce, cooked without an apron. Uncharacteristic. Perhaps she hadn't cooked it at all. Perhaps someone else had. Inspector Craddock met her in the hallway shortly after with preliminary results. "Monk's hood in the sauce crust," he said grimly. "Not much, but enough." "And the fingerprints on the spice jar?" "Only Lavinia's, no others." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And the telephone number?" "It's a literary agency in Toronto. Belongs to a woman named Vera Klein. She claims Harold submitted a cookbook manuscript under his own name 2 weeks ago. Very similar to Lavinia's last chapters." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "So he tried to sell her recipes, but perhaps she found out." Craddock frowned. "That still doesn't place him at the house on the day of the murder." "No," she agreed. "But perhaps someone helped." She walked through the house once more, lingering in the guest room where Harold had stayed. There was little left, no suitcase, no personal items, but behind the wardrobe she found a scrap of handwritten verse on hotel stationery. She recognized the handwriting at once. It matched the odd recipe card beside Lavinia's body. But more importantly, it didn't match the threatening note Elsie had found. That was Margaret's hand. A detail most might miss, but not Miss Marple. She'd seen Margaret's writing on old drafts and envelopes. The looping D, the way the S curved. Too sharply, telltale signs. Harold had motive. He wanted fame, wanted Lavinia's recipes for himself. But Margaret had opportunity. She had access to the cupboard, to the kitchen, to the aprons. She had reason to want Lavinia gone before the will could be changed. And she knew how to make poison look like a recipe. Miss Marple returned to her parlour that evening, where she sat by the fire and poured herself a modest glass of port. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. But tonight she thought about voices. The voice of the cousin, too loud with ambition. The voice of the niece, too calm in her grief. The voice of the maid, honest but scared, all speaking at once. But only one voice, steady, confident, and far too well prepared, had dared to write down a recipe for murder. The following morning brought with it a grey sky and a sharper edge to the air, as if nature itself had begun to tighten around the truth still hidden in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts having carried her late into the night. There was a pattern, she knew. There always was. But the shapes were overlapping, blurred by motive and misdirection. She made her way back to the Beecham residence, where Inspector Craddock had taken over the parlour and was now sifting through statements with growing frustration. "They all have reasons," he said wearily as she entered, "but nothing fits together cleanly. Too many pieces, too many grudges. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. It's rather like trying to cut a tart with a spoon. You can press and press, but you never get a proper slice. He raised an eyebrow, and she smiled gently before seating herself across from him. Let's consider what we know, not merely what we suspect. Harold Beecham stands to gain both profit and recognition by stealing Lavinia's recipes and selling them abroad. He had motive, and he had opportunity, at least during his visit. But we've no evidence he returned after he left, unless he had an accomplice, Craddock said. Quite. Someone with access. Someone who knew where Lavinia kept her drafts. Margaret fits that description, and her handwriting matches the note we found, which she denies writing. Miss Marple nodded, and yet her alibi is thin. She claims to have been in London the day of the death, but she arrived back in St. Mary Mead the following morning, far earlier than her train should have permitted. She says the train ran ahead of schedule. Yes, Miss Marple said, lightly. And the moon sometimes races the sun. She tapped her fingers together. Elsie, too, has reason, though not one she'd admit. She relied on Lavinia for both employment and patronage. But Lavinia, being Lavinia, had little patience for mistakes. I noticed bruises on Elsie's wrist the other day, subtle but fresh. It's possible Lavinia lost her temper recently. Craddock frowned. That's not a strong enough motive for murder. True, Miss Marple said, but fear can make people foolish, especially if they believe they'll be blamed. Craddock thumbed through the pages. Then there's the will. Margaret clearly believed she was being written out of it. That could explain her actions. But then why poison? Why the elaborate staging with the sauce and the recipe card? Because, Miss Marple said slowly, it was meant to be confusing. The recipe card was the misdirection, a concoction of absurd ingredients meant to look like a failed experiment, so that Lavinia's death could be written off as carelessness. But Harold's involvement suggests something larger, Craddock said. If he convinced Margaret to hand over drafts, and Lavinia found out, she'd have threatened to expose them both. Perhaps she did. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. But I still feel something's missing. A connection between Harold and Margaret. If they were working together, why stage a fight? Why burn letters? Why risk a visit just days before she died? Craddock sighed. To cover their tracks? Or, perhaps, she said thoughtfully, they weren't working together. Perhaps they were rivals. A pause followed, and Craddock glanced up sharply. You think they both wanted Lavinia's legacy, but not together? Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. Suppose Harold planned to profit from the recipes, and Margaret found out. Suppose Lavinia discovered the manuscript theft and threatened to report it. Now suppose Margaret saw that not as betrayal, but opportunity. If Lavinia were to die, Harold would be the obvious suspect, and if the recipe chapter were destroyed, no one could prove who it truly belonged to. Craddock considered. So Margaret frames Harold by mimicking the poisoned food, using ingredients she knows he's experimented with? She helps build the illusion, but she also muddles it, perhaps too cleverly. The recipe card's absurdity was deliberate. It mimicked Harold's flair for the exotic while making the whole scene look like an accident. Margaret knew no one would suspect her because she appeared too close to the victim, grieving, helpful, familiar. But Harold isn't here to defend himself, Craddock said slowly. Exactly. A vanished suspect. No concrete proof of return. Just a stolen manuscript in another country and some angry correspondence. Craddock shook his head. You said the motives didn't quite align, and now it feels like they're stacked atop each other. Because they are, Miss Marple said softly. Margaret wanted to be rid of Lavinia and see Harold blamed. Harold wanted Lavinia out of the way, so he could sell her work. Elsie wanted only to survive her employment without being accused. She stood and began pacing, small and slow. But the one thing I keep returning to is the missing chapter, the draft of the final recipe. Elsie mentioned Lavinia locking it away. Margaret didn't have it. Harold tried to recreate it. But the final copy, the one Lavinia actually worked from, must still be here. Craddock looked around. We've searched the house. Yes, she said, but not the place where Lavinia hid her most important things. She told me once that she never trusted drawers, said they made thieves lazy. She kept her savings in the lid of her biscuit tin, hollowed it out. They went together to the kitchen. Miss Marple pulled the tin down carefully, unscrewed the false top, and there, tightly folded, was a single sheaf of paper. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Taste. In it were several recipes, one of which began with lavender buds and ended with a note, to be used only for demonstration. Never consume raw. It was clear Lavinia had written it as a warning, perhaps for an upcoming public demonstration or press shoot. It wasn't poison, but it resembled a poison recipe so precisely that it could be easily misused. Anyone reading it hastily could think it genuine, or twist it into something deadly. Craddock looked at the paper. And if Margaret got her hands on this, she might have used it to confuse the police, frame Harold, and dispose of it afterward. Only she didn't find the original, just Harold's stolen version, which was incomplete. So she reconstructed the card herself, from memory. That's why it didn't match the manuscript or Lavinia's notes. Craddock's voice was grim. That's why she overplayed it. And why Harold was the perfect scapegoat, Miss Marple said. Margaret knew he'd already submitted something. It would take weeks to track him down. By then, she'd inherit, and the scandal would fade. But the will. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe Lavinia managed to post the updated copy. Elsie took the letter to the box just before her death. She told me she thought it was to a solicitor. Craddock let out a low breath. So the motive wasn't just pride. It was greed, and revenge, and fear, Miss Marple said quietly. Margaret feared being forgotten, feared Harold's success, and perhaps most of all feared Lavinia would finally cut her loose. They left the kitchen in silence. The web was nearly complete. Only the final strand remained, to see how Margaret would react once the truth was placed, piece by piece, in front of her. Miss Marple knew. She'd seen it before. Motives always tangled, but guilt had a curious way of unraveling, slowly, then all at once. By midday, the village buzz had reached its usual fever pitch. Word had spread that Inspector Craddock had located Harold Beecham in Dover, detained on suspicion of murder, and that he'd been carrying a folded copy of Lavinia's chapter manuscript in his luggage. The pages bore notes in his handwriting, along with marginal edits that mimicked Lavinia's phrasing just enough to raise alarm. The inspector, pressured by both the press and the coroner's impatience, made a brief public statement suggesting the case was nearing resolution. The villagers, eager for closure, seized on this as confirmation. To most, the matter was clear. Harold had stolen the recipes, poisoned Lavinia to prevent her from exposing him, and fled. An open and shut case, wrapped up tidily with a villain. They barely knew. But Miss Marple, who sat quietly in her garden that afternoon, stirring her tea without drinking it, was unconvinced. It wasn't simply that Harold lacked opportunity, though he did. It was that the murder itself had never been theatrical enough to be his. Harold was arrogant, not subtle, and everything about Lavinia's death, from the source to the recipe card to the neatness of the scene, spoke of control. Calculated misdirection. Harold, if he'd wanted Lavinia silenced, would have made noise. He'd have written something snide to the press or left behind a self-congratulatory trail. But this crime had been designed to vanish beneath layers of culinary confusion. She went again to the Beecham house, this time under the pretext of returning a book Lavinia had once lent her. Margaret opened the door, still in mourning black, though her eyes no longer looked so hollow. In fact, they were steady, too steady. "I suppose you've heard," she said, stepping aside to let Miss Marple in. "They've arrested Harold. I never thought it would come to that." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "It's always unsettling when someone close is suspected. You must be quite shaken." "I wouldn't say close," Margaret said. "We shared blood, but little else." Miss Marple took a slow look around the sitting room. A vase of lilies stood where the rose bouquet had been days earlier. The smell was stronger, more deliberate. There were no drafts or loose papers this time, just dusted shelves and silence. "Did he ever say he blamed Lavinia?" she asked. Margaret hesitated. Once, when she refused to let him publish one of her old travel notes as his own. He said she owed him, but I didn't think he meant anything serious by it. "I wonder," Miss Marple said mildly, "if Harold expected Lavinia to die just then. I wonder whether, when he fled, he believed the opportunity had merely fallen into his lap, a perfect storm." Margaret glanced away. "You don't believe he did it?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I believe he benefited from her death, but not all beneficiaries are guilty." She let the words hang there, then added, "Do you know what the post brought me this morning?" Margaret shook her head. "A letter from Lavinia, posted the day before her death. A little thank you for a book I'd lent her on historic desserts." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the neatly folded paper. "It's dated and cheerful. Not a whisper of fear or accusation." "That doesn't mean anything." "Oh, but it does," Miss Marple replied, her tone now subtly firmer. "It means she was not afraid of Harold. She was not bracing herself for betrayal. She was calm, reflective, even nostalgic. She wrote about her lemon tart recipe, said she'd finally gotten the balance right, a perfect acidity. But we know she never tasted it. She died before it left the sill." Margaret's posture shifted slightly. She could have lied. She lied often. Then let us suppose she was lying in the letter, pretending to be at peace. Then who was she lying to? Me or herself? Miss Marple tucked the paper away again. "There's something else, of course. The source. I thought it tested positive." "It did, for monkshood, but a specific variant, Aconitum napellus. Rare, difficult to handle. Not something one sprinkles in lightly. It must be processed, dried, ground. Not a thing you find in the average household." Margaret blinked, but she was always experimenting. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and yet the source was not in her pantry, not even in her herb garden. You see, I had Elsie check every jar, every plant." "There was nothing." Margaret crossed her arms. "So Harold brought it. Perhaps, or someone had it already. Someone who planned ahead." Miss Marple rose then, slowly, and crossed to the writing desk. "Do you mind?" she asked, gesturing toward the drawers. Margaret didn't answer. Miss Marple opened the top drawer and pulled out a small, elegant box of stationery. Nestled underneath were 2 used envelopes, addressed in Margaret's handwriting, one to a publishing house in London, and the other to a solicitor in Bath. "I thought you said Lavinia handled all her legal matters herself," Miss Marple murmured. Margaret said nothing. "The solicitor in Bath," Miss Marple went on, "confirmed receipt of a letter amending Lavinia's will, but he said it arrived unsigned, missing the final page. Rather odd, don't you think? She must have forgotten to include it, I suppose. But the envelope bore no trace of a second sheet having been folded into it, just the first page, typed and clipped at the end, as if torn from a draft." Margaret's fingers flexed at her sides. "And you think I did that?" "I think Lavinia may have shown you the letter, or you discovered it afterward. Either way, you knew what it meant." Your inheritance, gone. To Elsie, perhaps, or even to some foundation. That's ridiculous, Margaret said quietly. Is it? Miss Marple turned to face her directly now, because it explains everything else. The calm, the control, the missing chapter, the precise use of poison. Harold was the perfect decoy, but only because someone used him as one. Someone who understood Lavinia's habits, had access to her kitchen, and knew how to frame a death as culinary folly. Margaret's jaw tightened. So what now? Miss Marple sighed gently. Now? Inspector Craddock will review the documents. You've kept hidden and traced the purchase of powdered aconite to a chemist near your London flat. He will question your train conductor, who did not recall you boarding the early return, but did remember you asking if anyone would notice if you changed compartments midway. He will verify that your fingerprints were found not only on the recipe card, but beneath the label on the spice jar. Margaret exhaled slowly, a strange calm settling over her features. You really don't miss anything, do you? Oh, I miss many things, Miss Marple said gently, but I never forget. What people say when they think no one's listening. Margaret turned away then, staring out the window at the garden. They'll believe it was Harold. Everyone already does. For now, Miss Marple replied softly. But the truth, Miss Beauchamp, has a way of rising, like yeast. Quietly, invisibly at first, then all at once. And as the bells of the parish church began to toll the hour, Miss Marple knew the case would not rest tonight. A false victory had been declared, but the real ending waited just around the corner. Inspector Craddock arrived just as the light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the Beauchamp garden, where Miss Marple was trimming deadheads from her dahlias with steady, patient hands. He didn't speak right away. He rarely did when his thoughts were still unsettled. But Miss Marple, without turning, said gently, I imagine Harold isn't very pleased with the premature declaration. Craddock sighed and stepped closer. He's furious, denies everything. Says the manuscript was mailed to him anonymously 2 days before Lavinia died. Claims he came back to England because he feared being implicated. Says he had nothing to do with the recipe theft. He even offered to take a polygraph, if you can believe it. Miss Marple snipped another stem. I do believe it. A guilty man rarely volunteers to be questioned. It's usually the innocent, ones who insist upon being heard. He could still be lying. Of course he could. But I don't think he is. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. It's maddening. The evidence leans one way, the logic another. As it often does, Miss Marple said. Especially when the real cause has older roots. You've reviewed Lavinia's old correspondence, yes? I have. Nothing useful, until this. He produced a slim, faded envelope from his coat, found in her attic trunk, tucked behind a drawer, postmarked 19 years ago, from France. Miss Marple set her clippers aside and reached for the envelope with both hands, as though holding something delicate. The handwriting was elegant, sharp. Inside was a short letter and a photograph. The photo showed a younger Lavinia, seated beside a much younger woman with dark hair and sharp cheekbones, Margaret unmistakably. But there was a third figure, partly cropped, just a hand resting on Margaret's shoulder. The letter was brief. I have kept your secret this long, but I won't keep it forever. You know what he did. And you knew it wasn't an accident. The girl should never have been there. I will write again. You owe me. Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. You've checked the signature? Craddock nodded. Just initials. CD. No return address. No name. But I traced the handwriting to a woman named Clara Delacroix. She died 6 years ago in Marseille, widow of a hotelier. And here's the part that matters. She was once Lavinia's roommate. In Paris, around the same time, Lavinia stopped publishing anything for nearly a decade. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. What happened to Lavinia's husband? Died in a boating accident, Craddock said. Off the Riviera. Nasty business. Papers claimed it was misadventure. But there were rumors that he wasn't alone on the boat, that a woman drowned too, No identity ever confirmed. Miss Marple folded the letter back into the envelope. And the girl? The one the letter mentions? We don't know, but we believe she may have been Clara's niece, or possibly Clara's daughter. No official records, but we found a police note from Marseille in 1938. A domestic disturbance complaint naming Charles Beecham, Lavinia's husband, and a Clara Delacroix. No charges filed, but a child is mentioned. Present during incident, minor, female. So the threat in the letter, Miss Marple trailed off, eyes narrowing. It wasn't about the recipes, it was about the past. Something Lavinia thought was buried. Craddock nodded grimly. We think Clara resurfaced years later, maybe tried to blackmail Lavinia, or perhaps just wanted her to acknowledge something. But Lavinia never responded. The letters stopped. And Margaret. We believe she intercepted one of the early letters, probably never told Lavinia, maybe even met Clara herself. There's a record of Margaret travelling to Marseille for 3 days in the early 1950s. No explanation. Perhaps to learn the truth, Miss Marple said quietly. And perhaps that truth turned bitter. Craddock exhaled. If she knew what happened on that boat, if she believed Lavinia was complicit, she wouldn't need money as a motive anymore, Miss Marple said. She'd have resentment, legacy, a need to undo Lavinia's image of perfection. And the niece, the child in the police report, could she be connected to anyone else in this case? Miss Marple fell silent for a long moment. Then, very softly, she said, "Have you considered Elsie?" Craddock blinked. The maid? She's not local, arrived only a year ago, with references that seem too neat. No family, no background beyond a vague mention of boarding school in the south. But I've seen her eyes when she speaks of Lavinia. There's something colder there than grief, something careful. And she's always watching Margaret. You think Elsie could be the child from the boat? It would explain her presence, her proximity, and her silence. She's not here just for a job. She's been watching both of them, waiting. Craddock looked away toward the road. We need to speak to her again, carefully. I'll do it, Miss Marple said. But not directly. A gentle nudge will. Later that evening, Miss Marple invited Elsie for tea. They sat in her small parlour, the ticking clock the only sound for several minutes. Did you ever visit France, dear? She asked gently, pouring a second cup. Elsie paused. No, ma'am. Never even passed through. No. Strange. You have a trace of the accent. I noticed it when you said confiture the other day. Most English girls say jam. Elsie hesitated. My mother, she was French. She taught me some things. I suppose it stayed. Did she work in a hotel, perhaps? The teacup in Elsie's hand trembled ever so slightly before she steadied it. Yes, I think so. Miss Marple gave a kind smile. And your father? I never knew him. Ah, Miss Marple said softly, but I think you knew who he was, or at least who people said he was. And that's why you came to work for Lavinia Beecham. Elsie's eyes flickered, and for the first time her posture stiffened into something that wasn't grief or fear, but resolve. I just wanted to know what kind of woman she really was. And now you do? I thought I did, Elsie said. But then she started being kind. She let me read her notes, let me try her sources. It was confusing. She wasn't what I expected. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Did you write the poison recipe card? No. The answer came quickly. I wouldn't have hurt her. I wanted answers, not revenge. And Margaret? Elsie swallowed. She hated Lavinia. She didn't hide it. I saw her come in the night before. Said she'd forgotten a scarf. But I checked later. She didn't leave one behind. Craddock, listening silently just beyond the doorway, stepped into the room then. "You're not in any trouble, Elsie. But I think you've told us more than you realize." Miss Marple folded her hands. "The past never stays buried, Inspector, not when so many people build their lives on its ashes." And as the room fell quiet, the tangled roots of Lavinia Beecham's legacy at last began to rise into the light, carrying with them more than just secrets. They carried the weight of a crime long in the making. The following morning, a peculiar calm seemed to settle over St. Mary Mead. But for Miss Marple, the stillness was only surface deep. Beneath it pulsed the quiet tension of a story not quite concluded. Margaret remained at large. Harold was still being questioned. And Elsie, now half revealed as a girl, shaped by a tragedy not of her making, had stepped back into silence, unsure whether she was witness, orphan, or something more. Miss Marple, however, knew they were close. The truth was coiled tightly, like the spring of an old clock, waiting for the right touch to unspool. And that touch, she felt, would not come through direct confrontation or legal pressure. Margaret was far too controlled for that. What was needed now was subtlety, something sideways, something that would slip past the guard she kept so tightly in place. So Miss Marple arranged an afternoon gathering, just 3 of them, under the pretense of finalizing Lavinia's household matters. She invited Margaret and Elsie to tea, with Inspector Craddock observing discreetly from the back of the sitting room, posing as a quiet note-taker. The conversation began plainly enough, with Miss Marple reminiscing over Lavinia's older recipes, the state of her garden, and whether the hydrangeas might still bloom after the early frost. But all of it was preamble. The real test lay nestled inside a plate of scones. Miss Marple had prepared them herself, using one of Lavinia's earliest published recipes, scones for quiet reflection. But she had made a small change. Nothing. Dangerous, of course, just a harmless substitution. She had replaced the usual nutmeg with dried fennel, a difference subtle to most palates but noticeable to anyone familiar with the original. She served them with cream and jam, making sure both Margaret and Elsie took one. She did not say a word as they ate, only offered refills of tea. Then, as casually as one might mention a cloudy forecast, she said, "I've always found Lavinia's scones impossible to reproduce. She had a gift for balance. Just the right amount of nutmeg. Mine always taste off." Elsie blinked but said nothing. Margaret, however, paused mid-bite and frowned. "These have nutmeg, don't they?" "No," Miss Marple said softly, setting down her cup. "They have fennel. Quite different, wouldn't you say?" Margaret's lips pressed into a line. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "most people wouldn't notice, even those who baked with Lavinia regularly. Unless, of course, they'd had to study her every ingredient, replicate it perfectly, perhaps even forge a draft meant to pass as her own." Margaret didn't speak, but her fingers curled slowly around the edge of her plate. Elsie looked between them, uncertain. Miss Marple went on, her tone light but unrelenting. "I remember years ago a scandal in Edinburgh where a woman poisoned her husband with foxglove in a rabbit stew. The authorities nearly dismissed it as foodborne illness, until a neighbour noted the flavour was off, too bitter. The case turned on that one detail. Flavour tells the truth, Margaret, even when people don't." Margaret stood abruptly. "Is this your way of accusing me? Through scones?" "Only of having an excellent memory," Miss Marple said calmly. "One. Too good, in fact. Good enough to remember the exact proportions of a recipe you claimed you hadn't seen in years." "She taught me those recipes," Margaret snapped. "She wrote them after you stopped working with her," Miss Marple replied, "including the one these scones are based on. Scones for Quiet Reflection was published only last month." A silence followed. Thick. Margaret glanced at Elsie and something passed between them, too quick to be spoken but not missed. Miss Marple saw it. So did Craddock. Margaret sat down again slowly. "You're playing games." "No," Miss Marple said, quietly. "You are, and you've been very good at it. But the mask always slips. A flavour here. A misplaced word. A letter opened before it arrived. You tried to control the narrative, frame Harold, silence Lavinia's secrets, and inherit the name. You almost succeeded." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof." "I don't need more," Miss Marple said, "because you've just given it. The way you tasted the scone expecting nutmeg. The way you reacted when it wasn't there. You knew the recipe too well. You tried to reproduce it from memory when you wrote that recipe card. But you missed the nutmeg then, didn't you? You used lavender instead. A detail Lavinia never allowed in her scones. She said it muddied the crumb." Craddock finally spoke. "And that card is now tied to the poisoned sauce." Margaret's mouth twitched. "It was just a mistake." "No," Miss Marple said. "It was your voice on paper, a fingerprint in flour." The room fell still again. Outside, the church bell struck 4. Elsie shifted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew, didn't you? About the boat. About Clara." Margaret's gaze snapped to her. "What are you talking about?" "I saw the photograph," Elsie said, trembling slightly. "I saw you in it. You were there that summer. That was years ago, and you knew who I was," Elsie said, firmer now. "Not when I first arrived, but later, after you saw my mother's locket. You knew, and you said nothing." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Elsie's wrist. "You were bait," she said softly. "She let you stay because she thought you might lead her to something. Leverage, perhaps, or distraction." Margaret's expression began to crumble at last, not from guilt, but from fury. She ruined everything. Lavinia pretended she'd moved on, but she never let go of that past. She buried it in cookbooks and editorials and afternoon teas. But she was a fraud, a coward. She let that girl drown. "She tried to save her," Elsie said. "Clara told me. Lavinia dived in after them both. Only one came back." Margaret's face twisted. "She should have stayed under." And with that, the silence snapped. Craddock rose. "I think that's enough, Miss Beecham." Margaret didn't protest. She stared down at the table, eyes locked on the crumbled half of a fennel, and said nothing more. Miss Marple sat back quietly, reaching again for her tea. Not triumphantly, not even with relief. There was no pleasure in watching a person unravel, only inevitability. It always came down to something small, a taste, a habit, a detail someone thought no one would catch. And as she watched Craddock guide Margaret gently out the door, Miss Marple looked again to Elsie, who sat in the quiet, not broken, but still uncertain. The past had caught up. But what came next for her might just be her own beginning. The evening after Margaret's quiet arrest passed with the subdued rhythm of routine returning to the village. Curtains drawn, lights flickering in tidy rows, teacups clinking gently behind closed doors. But even as the surface returned to calm, a low tension curled beneath it, a sense that something was still unfinished. Miss Marple felt it in her fingertips as she sorted through her recipe cards, trying half-heartedly to put her mind elsewhere. Yet it refused to settle. The confession, such as it was, had cracked Margaret's facade, but not shattered it. Something about her calm in the final moments had been too neat, too prepared, more like retreat than defeat. The next morning brought confirmation that her unease had been warranted. Inspector Craddock knocked on Miss Marple's door just after 8, unshaven and tight-lipped, holding a brown paper envelope that had clearly been resealed. He sat without ceremony and laid it on her table. The original draft chapter, the one from Lavinia's biscuit tin. "It's gone." Miss Marple, pouring tea, didn't look up immediately. "Gone?" "Replaced," Craddock said grimly. "Same. Paper, Same formatting, but different content. It's been altered. The forensic lab confirmed it. Different typewriter ribbon, and the signature line has been tampered with. The page looks the same unless you compare the ink under magnification. She set the teapot down and finally looked at him. But only someone with access to the evidence lockup could have done that. Precisely. Which is why the sergeant on duty is now suspended, and I've put in a request for internal review. Miss Marple remained still for a moment, then said, "Someone is trying to bury the connection between the draft and the source. If the chapter was the final link tying Margaret to the forgery, this destroys the bridge." "It gets worse," Craddock said. "The false recipe card, the one found by Lavinia's body, has vanished entirely. Taken from the evidence box at the station. No sign of forced entry." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. That card was the linchpin. It tied the kitchen scene to the intent. Without it, it becomes theory again. The confession may stand, but motive erodes. And with Margaret now requesting counsel and claiming she was coerced by emotional manipulation, the confession may not hold either. Her solicitor claims she was goaded into paranoia. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already stepping back through the trail. "And Harold?" "He's been released," Craddock said. "No charges. We had nothing but a misunderstood submission and his arrogance." "So someone wants this story forgotten," Miss Marple said softly. "And they're quite determined." "About it," Craddock exhaled, "which means they're still watching, still reaching." She stood then, without urgency, and retrieved her handbag. There may be one place they haven't reached yet. They walked together to Lavinia's house, now shuttered and still. Inside, the air had turned stale with disuse, but the faint trace of rosewater and spices still lingered. Miss Marple moved directly to the spice cupboard and opened it. The jars sat exactly as before, alphabetical, ordered. Except the fennel was now missing. She said nothing, only glanced at Craddock. He didn't speak either. Then they moved to Lavinia's writing desk, where the ink blotter still rested. Miss Marple pulled back the pad. The surface beneath was blank, too blank. The pressure marks had been removed, the pad replaced. A new blotter, identical in color but free of any impressions. Whoever had entered had known exactly what to destroy. "They've wiped the desk," Craddock muttered. "No," Miss Marple said. "They've wiped the story, the paper, the spices, the notes. They're unraveling her legacy in reverse, page by page." It was then Elsie appeared, standing quietly in the kitchen doorway. Her voice was hesitant. "Someone was here last night." Miss Marple turned slowly. "When?" "Just after midnight. I was in the cottage behind the rose garden. I saw the back gate move. I thought it was wind. Then I heard the latch, softly. I didn't come out. I was frightened." "You didn't see who it was?" "No. Just a figure. Tall. Didn't move. Like Margaret. Faster. Maybe younger." Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You think someone else is cleaning up? On whose behalf?" Miss Marple looked at Elsie. "Did Lavinia ever mention anyone she feared?" Elsie shook her head. "No. But she used to keep a letter in her Bible. Said it was from someone who saved her once. I never saw the name." They searched the house. Again. The Bible, which had sat untouched on the parlor shelf, was still there, but the bookmark was gone. No letter. Miss Marple looked at the flyleaf and found a faint, erased indent. A corner had once been folded there. She closed the book gently. "There's someone else," she said, "who knew Lavinia before she became a public figure. Someone who saw what happened in France, not Clara. Someone else who benefited from silence." "Clara's husband?" Craddock asked. "No," Miss Marple said. "He died years before. But Clara mentioned another name in the postscript of one letter I've seen." We both know what Charles did, and we both stayed quiet. You, for your marriage. Me, because of Gabriel. Craddock paused. Gabriel? Miss Marple nodded. We assumed it was a lover or an accomplice, but I believe Gabriel was someone else entirely. A cook. Lavinia once told me she learned her herb pairings from a man with a knife and a conscience. I thought she was being poetic. Now I wonder if he was real. Craddock's eyes narrowed. And if he was in the house last night, then he's not trying to cover up Margaret's crimes. He's trying to erase his own history, one that Lavinia may have finally written. Down. Outside, the sky had darkened again. Rain threatened. Miss Marple turned to Elsie. I want you to stay at the vicarage tonight. Not alone. Elsie hesitated. Do you think I'm in danger? I think you know too much, Miss Marple said gently. And someone is making sure that those who know too much are left with nothing to say. Craddock made arrangements quickly. By nightfall, Elsie was moved discreetly, and 2 plainclothes officers remained on watch. Miss Marple sat that night in her parlour, with the light dimmed, piecing through old newspaper clippings, one hand resting on the edge of an envelope she'd retrieved from her own files. It was a page Lavinia had once sent her years ago, half of a recipe, and on the back a name, G. Havers, Marseille, 1947. The writing was unfamiliar, a man's. She traced the name with her finger. Havers, Gabriel Havers. She closed the envelope and reached for her knitting. She didn't know what was coming next, only that someone out there wasn't finished yet. The case, once so near its end, was suddenly growing again, not wider, but deeper, and whatever had been left to rot in the past was now stirring. The evidence had vanished, but someone still remembered. The rain finally broke just after dawn, a cold, persistent drizzle that blurred the windows of St. Mary Mead and silenced the usual morning routines. Miss Marple, still in her shawl, sat at the breakfast table nursing a cup of weak tea, her eyes fixed on the letter from years ago, bearing the name Gabriel Havers. She had sent word to Inspector Craddock the night before to search immigration and travel records, hoping the name might still exist in some dormant archive. Her mind churned not with conclusions, but with the uneasy awareness that something vital remained unspoken. The deliberate removal of evidence, the altered chapter, the disappearance of the spice jar, it wasn't just misdirection anymore. It was a cleansing, and those who wiped clean did so when the final blow was yet to fall. The knock came at just past 8. 2 brisk raps, firm but not panicked. When she opened the door, Craddock was there, soaked through, with an expression that left no room for pleasantries. She's gone, he said flatly. Elsie? He nodded. Left the vicarage sometime in the night. Window was forced outward, no sign of struggle. The officers on watch said they saw no movement. We think. She slipped out before the shift change. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Not ran, taken. She left a note. If it's hers. He pulled it from his coat and handed it over. It was written in unsteady cursive. I need answers. I have to do this myself. Don't follow me, please. I'm safe. Miss Marple read it twice, then shook her head. She's not safe. She may have gone to find someone, but she's not the one behind this. Craddock said nothing, but his jaw tightened. She trusted me, Miss Marple continued softly. She wouldn't vanish the night after confessing so much, not when she finally had something to hold on to. Someone coerced her, or frightened her. We've circulated her photo. Nothing yet. Miss Marple's mind was already moving. She's not running to escape. She's being moved. Because she knows something the killer can't risk her remembering. Then we need to find Gabriel Havers. I think we already have, she said, voice barely above a whisper. But we've only been looking at him in pieces. Craddock leaned in. Go on. She turned toward her sitting room, retrieving the envelope with Lavinia's old recipe fragment. This handwriting, it's the same as the recipe card that vanished from the scene. Not the one Margaret wrote. The earlier one, the prototype. But you said that card had been replaced. It had. But I saw the original before it disappeared. I recognized the way the G is hooked like a number 9, and the cross on the T is always high. Same here. You're saying Gabriel Havers wrote the recipe card? Yes, which means he's been in this all along. Not a ghost from Lavinia's past, but a presence in her present. Craddock frowned. Where would he be now? Why surface after all this time? Because Lavinia finally wrote about him? I suspect she used him as inspiration for one of her characters, or recipes. And perhaps he saw it as a betrayal. Or worse, a threat to the story he thought they'd buried. Craddock exhaled. And if he's resurfaced, and Elsie went looking for him, she won't find what she's hoping for. Later that day, as the village held its breath under a sky that refused to brighten, news arrived from a delivery boy sent out toward Bramble Hollow, a disused cottage 2 miles from the village, once belonging to Lavinia's late aunt, Long, believed to be abandoned. The boy had approached to deliver eggs and seen the gate unlatched, the door slightly ajar. No sign of a resident. But something had made him uneasy. The smell of burnt paper. Craddock and Miss Marple reached the cottage shortly after noon. It was cold inside. A fire had been hastily extinguished, embers still faintly warm. On the floor, a pile of charred. Pages, mostly illegible, smouldered in the hearth. A single shoe lay near the threshold. A woman's. The room had been stripped of personality, as though it had only briefly held someone before being cleared in panic. They searched the place in silence. In the back room, they found what they feared. A scrap of torn fabric, caught on a rusted nail, stained faintly with blood. And beside it, folded carefully on a chair, Elsie's cardigan. No body, Craddock said. But someone wanted us to think she's been hurt. Or silenced, Miss Marple said quietly. But it's a performance. Someone's staging scenes now, not just cleaning but storytelling. They're rewriting the crime as it happens. Craddock turned to her. So what do we do? We stop reacting to the chapters they hand us. We go back to the beginning. That evening, Miss Marple returned alone to Lavinia's house, insisting to Craddock that she needed to move freely, without an officer pacing the stairs. She sat in Lavinia's old armchair in the kitchen, where the first threads of murder had begun, and looked again at the shelf where the missing fennel had once stood. There, faint in the wood grain, was a smear of oil. A thumbprint, perhaps, or the residue from a bottle once hastily replaced. And then, beneath the lowest shelf, something caught her eye. A metal hinge, camouflaged into the cabinetry, almost invisible. She reached under, pressed gently, and a small panel popped forward. Inside, yellowed pages lay folded with string. A recipe draft. But more than that, letters, dozens of them, correspondence between Lavinia and someone signing simply, "Gee," she unfolded one with trembling fingers. "You promised. I told you what I saw. I gave you silence. But you owe me more than that. You owe me my name. You owe me my daughter." Miss Marple sat back slowly. Gabriel had known. Not only about the boat, about the girl, about Elsie. He hadn't come to kill Lavinia. He'd come to reclaim what he believed was his. But Lavinia had refused, perhaps out of fear, or guilt, or pride. And now Elsie was gone, and the final pages of the story had been dragged into a furnace. But Miss Marple had the last chapter still, and she knew now who Gabriel Havers was, and where he would go next. The letters were brittle with age, but sharp, with feeling, the kind of writing that didn't hide behind formality. Gabriel's words, once read with care, revealed far more than threats. They carried longing, betrayal, even a twisted form of grief. He wasn't simply demanding Lavinia acknowledge the past. He believed she had taken something from him, his daughter. And though the pages didn't mention Elsie by name, the tone, dark, wounded, obsessive, tied everything together. It wasn't just legacy he wanted. It was recognition. He'd kept quiet after the incident in Marseille, had taken Lavinia's silence as a contract. But now, with Lavinia's fame growing, her final chapters nearing print, he must have felt erased. Not forgotten, erased. And something inside him wouldn't allow that. Miss Marple sat in the dim kitchen as the light faded behind the curtains, her hands resting lightly on the stack of hidden letters. It had always come back to this kitchen, this precise corner of Lavinia's world, the spice rack, the draft pages, the sauce, the mislabeled jars. The crime hadn't been one sudden act of rage, but a careful layering of messages and misdirection, shaped like a recipe, ingredients stirred in quietly over time. She thought back to something Margaret had said early on, during their first conversation after Lavinia's death. She got secretive. She started locking the cupboard with the recipe notes even when no one was around. At the time, Miss Marple had assumed it referred to the stolen chapter. But what if it hadn't been the recipe she was hiding at all? What if Lavinia had realized that Gabriel was already near and had begun hiding not from him, but from what he might do? And then another voice came back, Elsie's, when she first described the day Lavinia died. She just wanted to finish her sauce. Lavinia, unusually alone in the kitchen, preparing something new. No apron. That had struck the delivery boy as odd. Why would a woman who prized cleanliness and presentation suddenly forego the one garment she never cooked without? Miss Marple rose from her seat and crossed to the stove. The apron hooks were still there, one slightly bent, as if torn recently. She stared at them for a moment, then looked down at the floorboards. Just beneath the stove's edge, a faint discoloration. In the wood, something spilled, then wiped poorly. Not the thick, dark stain of sauce, but something finer. Oil or tincture. The sauce Lavinia made that day had tested positive for monkshood, but the sauce had never been found in her pantry or herb garden. The jar had been missing, later replaced. And now something else clicked into place. An offhand comment by Inspector Craddock just 2 nights ago, after Harold's release. We checked Lavinia's herb garden twice. Nothing toxic. Just lavender, thyme, and a wild patch of sweet Cicely near the fence. Sweet Cicely. A fragrant plant, often confused with similar stalks, and deadly in the right combination. Miss Marple turned sharply and walked back to the sitting room. On the bookshelf was Lavinia's first cookbook, Notes from a Country Stove. She flipped quickly to the index, then to the marked page on simple tinctures for aromatic stews. There it was, Cicely stock, used for sweetness in meat dishes, but with a handwritten footnote in Lavinia's curling script. Don't confuse wild fennel with Cicely unless bitterness is intended. Bitterness. The missing fennel jar had not been taken to hide an ingredient. It had been swapped. Because Gabriel had known Lavinia would notice the taste if she had lived long enough to try her sauce. He hadn't tampered with the jar to kill her. He'd tampered with it to teach her something. The monk's hood hadn't been delivered through the fennel. It had come from something else entirely, her apron. Miss Marple returned to the stove, stooped low, and reached behind it. It was the one place the cleaners had overlooked. Behind the enamel frame, wedged where the floor met the baseboard, was a thin scrap of linen, white, cotton, embroidered with the faint remnants of Lavinia's monogram, LB, a torn strap. The missing apron. Gabriel had soaked it. Not with sauce, with poison. A tincture laced with aconitine, applied where Lavinia's hands would naturally reach, then hung back on the hook. But Lavinia, in a rare moment of carelessness or perhaps fatigue, had cooked that morning without it, and when she finished preparing the sauce, she went to clean up and wiped her hands, on the inside of the apron she wasn't wearing. Maybe she tossed it aside after the meal was prepared. Maybe she folded it away. But the contact had already been made, absorbed through the skin. Tasteless. Untraceable by the time her body was found. And with the recipe card left beside her, no one would question that it had been the source. Miss Marple stood slowly, heart thudding with quiet finality. The pattern had always been there. It wasn't about the draft or the recipe or even the inheritance. It was about being forgotten, about forcing Lavinia to taste a bitterness she had long refused to acknowledge. Gabriel Havers hadn't meant to murder Lavinia over greed. He had poisoned her to ensure she finally carried the flavor of guilt to her grave. And now, if he had taken Elsie, the stakes were no longer symbolic. He believed she was his daughter. And if Lavinia had denied him recognition in life, he might believe Elsie would grant him purpose in death. Miss Marple didn't wait. She sent a telegram through the village operator with a single line for Craddock. He used the apron. Monkshood absorbed. Check all back entrances. Havers seeks legacy, not escape. And she herself walked back to Bramble Hollow with a raincoat pulled tight and a small tin of lavender lozenges clutched in her gloved hand. Because if Gabriel Havers was still rewriting the story, Miss Marple intended to be on the final page. The path to Bramble Hollow was still slick with rain, the narrow trail swallowed by overgrown hedges and draped in mist that blurred the distance ahead. Miss Marple walked without hesitation, her sensible boots sinking into the soft earth, each step echoing a quiet certainty. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that desperation made people loud, and loudness gave one away. But those who believed themselves righteous, those who thought they were the author of every page, they moved with quiet conviction. Gabriel Havers was not hiding. He was waiting. The cottage came into view like a smudge through fog, low and squat against the trees. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, and no lights burned inside. Still, the latch on the gate had been recently turned. The mud bore the imprint of a single heel, deep and pointed. Not Elsie's. Too heavy. Too deliberate. She entered the garden quietly, hands in her coat pockets, and knocked once on the door before turning the knob herself. It gave way without resistance. Inside, the air was damp and still, but not empty. She could feel it. Presence, not absence. He was seated by the cold fireplace where the last fire had burned down to ash, legs crossed, hands resting loosely on the arms of the chair. Gabriel Havers. He was older than the name suggested, grey in the beard, but his posture retained the sharpness of someone who had never quite aged into the comfort of life. On the table beside him sat a small glass vial and a folded piece of cloth, the remains of Lavinia's apron. Miss Marple closed the door behind her. "She never wore it," he said without looking up. "I thought she would. I thought she would reach for it instinctively. But she didn't. She reached for it later, wiped her hands. Habit, just delayed." Miss Marple nodded slightly, then stepped forward until she stood just beyond the reach of the hearth. "You planned it carefully." "She owed me that care," he said. "She owed me more than she ever gave." "You're not here to run," Miss Marple said calmly. "You stayed for her, and for Elsie." Gabriel's gaze shifted then, slowly, as though weighing the effort of response. "She doesn't know. About me. Lavinia made sure of that. Changed names, records, hid her in schools, gave her to other people and paid them to forget who I was. She thought she was protecting her," Miss Marple said. "She was protecting herself," Gabriel snapped. "Protecting her name, her books, her legend." There was silence for a moment. Miss Marple moved to the edge of the table, eyes on the vial. "And Elsie?" "She's alive," he said. "In the back room. I gave her something to help her rest, Nothing harmful. I needed time. To do what? Gabriel looked at her for the first time. His eyes were not cruel, but hollow in a way that suggested they had once burned too brightly and had since gone cold. To explain. She thinks Lavinia took her in out of kindness, that her mother died by accident. But it wasn't an accident. Lavinia could have saved them both, Clara and the girl. She hesitated. She panicked. And when she came out of the water, with just Elsie in her arms, she turned the tragedy into her own beginning. The cookbook started a year later, the fame, the invention of the strong widow, but it was built on the silence of 2 dead people and 1 abandoned child. She wasn't abandoned, Miss Marple said gently. She was taken from me, he said. I begged to be part of her life. Lavinia refused, said I was unstable, that I'd confuse her. Miss Marple paused. Were you? He smiled faintly, without humour. Yes, but not in the way she meant. I was angry. I still am. But I would never have hurt her. I just wanted her to know, to understand who I was before Lavinia rewrote me. Miss Marple glanced again at the vial. That's why you wrote the recipe card. That's why you copied her tone, her style. You wanted her to die as a result of her own fiction. Gabriel's voice lowered. She made stories of everything. Even grief, even guilt. But recipes lie, Miss Marple. You can change ingredients, rename them, but the bitterness stays. Miss Marple stepped to the doorway of the back room. May I? He didn't move to stop her. Inside, the girl was sleeping, peacefully it seemed, under a thin blanket, her hair brushed neatly behind one ear. A basin of water sat beside the bed, along with a cup of tea now gone cold. Not a prison, but a pause. Miss Marple returned. To the kitchen. She doesn't know who she is, Gabriel said softly. She knows who she isn't, Miss Marple replied. And that's enough for now. She can decide the rest. He looked up again. Will you take me in? I think you want to be taken, she said. He gave a tired nod. I'm done writing. It was Craddock who arrived shortly after, having followed Miss Marple's note delivered through the constable's boy. He entered with his usual economy, quiet, professional, no raised voice or drawn weapon. Gabriel surrendered without resistance, hands offered not in defeat, but as if presenting a final page. Later, after the sun had pierced through the clouds, and Miss Marple returned to her parlour, she sat alone with a teacup cooling in her hand. The story had not been about fame or money, nor even envy. It had been about erasure. Gabriel had not been trying to destroy Lavinia's legacy. He had been trying to insert himself back into it, a ghost who wanted only to be remembered, not as a villain, but as a man who had once held a child in his arms and lost everything else to silence. And in a strange way, he had succeeded. Because now, long after the cookbooks faded, someone would remember his name, not in ink, but in truth. The wind had turned colder by the time Miss Marple made her way back to the vicarage. The sun, barely risen above the village rooftops, filtered weakly through the lace curtains as she removed her gloves, folded them neatly, and laid them beside the fireplace. She sat without a word, not because she lacked anything to say, but because what needed saying had yet to reach its final audience. Gabriel Havers had been taken into custody, his story pieced together at last, not through his threats or misdirection, but through the careful, painful unraveling of his silences. Yet one thread still dangled uncut, and Miss Marple knew the tale wasn't truly finished. She waited only a short time before Craddock arrived. His manner was brisk, tired, and laced with a wariness that came from knowing the ground beneath him was still shifting. He paced once across the room, then stood with arms folded at the hearth. He told us everything, he said, about Lavinia, the boat, the girl, even the letters. He made no effort to deny it. But, Miss Marple said gently. He didn't admit to murder. Craddock frowned. He admitted to soaking the apron and said it was meant to frighten her, not kill her. Craddock hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple looked up then, and her eyes held the soft glint of a truth, finally ready to rise. Because it wasn't Gabriel who administered the fatal touch. He left the apron, yes, but someone else put it into Lavinia's hands. Craddock's brow creased. You think there was a second actor? I think, Miss Marple said, that Margaret Beauchamp never left the stage. He turned slowly. She's in custody. She's in holding, Miss Marple corrected. And she believes she's been outplayed, but only by Gabriel, not by me. Craddock said nothing, but his silence was no longer dismissive. She found the apron first, Miss Marple continued. After Gabriel had left it behind, she saw it not as a warning, but an opportunity. She knew Lavinia would handle it again, out of habit. She knew the poison would be absorbed through touch, and all she had to do was ensure the conditions were right. No apron worn that day, a sudden need to clean the kitchen, a recipe card left with suspicious ingredients to confuse. The trail. Gabriel's plan became her weapon, and his guilt, her shield. But why keep going after his arrest? Miss Marple leaned forward. Because Margaret didn't care about Gabriel's threats. She cared about inheritance, about clearing her path. And when she realized Lavinia had started writing about her past, perhaps even about Margaret herself, she decided not just to eliminate Lavinia, but to burn the last pages. That's why the draft chapter was replaced, why the recipe card vanished, and why Elsie disappeared. Craddock's voice dropped. You're saying Margaret helped orchestrate Elsie's disappearance? No, Miss Marple said. She followed her. When she learned Elsie was Gabriel's daughter, she saw the last threat to her claim. She never expected Gabriel to take the girl gently. She thought he would flee. But when he didn't, when he waited, when he surrendered, she realized she had failed. So she waited. And now, she'll try again. Craddock stood still, but the lines around his mouth tightened. So how do we catch her? With the final recipe, Miss Marple said. She asked Craddock to send a message, one written in Margaret's hand, using a note she had signed previously, with a carefully chosen line. Meet me at the house. There's one final page they haven't found. The bait was simple, and it worked. Just before sunset, Margaret appeared at Lavinia's house, dressed in black, and walking with the careful stride of someone attempting not to look hurried. She stepped over the threshold, like it was still hers, closed the door behind her, and made her way to the study. Miss Marple was already there, seated in Lavinia's armchair beside the desk, a single page folded in her lap. Margaret's eyes flicked to it, then to Miss Marple. You lied, she said softly. I did, Miss Marple replied. I said there was one final page, but I never said whose. Margaret remained still, but her hand curled slowly into a fist. You can't prove anything, Miss Marple didn't move. Not with fingerprints, not with fibers, but I can prove it with knowledge. Margaret said nothing, her face cold. You included lavender on the recipe card, Miss Marple said. Gabriel never did. He despised the scent, called it a distraction. To the nose, I found his comment in a letter to Lavinia. You wouldn't have known that. But you included it because you'd seen Lavinia use it before. You forged the card. You placed it beside her, not Gabriel. Margaret stepped back slightly. That's conjecture. Miss Marple's tone stayed steady. No. Conjecture was yesterday. Today is the answer. You took Gabriel's discarded apron and placed it where you knew Lavinia would reach for it. You lured Elsie out of hiding because you feared she'd inherit everything. And when that didn't work, you tried to vanish her too. Margaret's voice trembled. She was nothing, she was the truth, Miss Marple interrupted. The truth Lavinia was ready to name. And now, I believe, the police are on their way to hear the rest.